Richard stood behind the counter of his car dealership, surveying the showroom with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The racist car salesman gets the shock of his life when he slaps the wrong man. Richard, a smug car salesman, thought he could judge anyone by appearance. So when Marcus, a calm but confident black man, walked into his dealership, Richard's racist instincts kicked in. Dismissing Marcus as beneath him, Richard slapped him during a heated exchange, unaware that Marcus wasn't just any customer. That single slap would turn Richard's world upside down in ways he never saw coming. Dealership had been in his family for decades, passed down from his father, who had built it from the ground up. It was a source of pride but also a burden. Richard always felt he was living in his father's shadow, pressured to live up to the older man's reputation for hard work and toughness. His father's lessons had been clear. Work with those who belong and don't waste time on those who don't. It was a worldview that had become ingrained in Richard's mind. The morning had started like any other, quiet, with a handful of potential customers browsing the lot. Richard's phone buzzed occasionally with emails and notifications, but nothing substantial. His life had become routine, and although his business was steady, he had a gnawing sense of being left behind in a rapidly changing world. The city was becoming more diverse, and with it came new challenges. Richard had always preferred the way things were, predictable, safe, familiar. He wasn't prepared for what came next. The doorbell chimed and a tall black man walked into the dealership. His casual clothes, sneakers, a simple hoodie, and jeans, immediately put Richard on edge. He didn't look like the typical buyer that Richard envisioned. In Richard's mind, serious buyers dressed the part. They came in wearing nice suits or at least something that suggested they had money. This man, with his easy stride and unhurried manner, didn't fit that image. Marcus, on the other hand, walked into the dealership with a purpose. He wasn't here for himself. He was shopping for his younger brother, Jerome, who had recently graduated from college, the first in their family to do so. Buying a car for Jerome was more than just a gift. It was a symbol of success, of escape from the harsh realities that had defined their upbringing. Marcus had grown up in a tough neighborhood where opportunities were few and far between, but he had found a way to rise. Not through traditional paths, but through control, influence, and a deeply rooted sense of responsibility to his community. Unlike many of his peers, Marcus had never been interested in the chaotic violence of street life. He was strategic. By the time he reached adulthood, he had become the leader of one of the most powerful gangs in the city. But Marcus didn't see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a protector. His gang was his family, and his neighborhood was his territory, not to exploit but to shield from those who would do it harm. Marcus was feared, respected, and, in many circles, untouchable. Yet here, in this dealership, he was just another black man, and he knew it. As Marcus approached a sleek black SUV, he ran his hand along its polished surface, inspecting the craftsmanship. He had the money to buy it outright, but he wasn't here to flaunt his wealth. For Marcus, power was never about showing off. It was about knowing when to reveal your hand and when to keep it hidden. But before he could ask any questions about the vehicle, Richard's voice cut through the silence. "You sure you can afford that?" Richard asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He didn't bother hiding the disdain in his tone. To him, Marcus was a time waster, not a serious customer. Marcus paused, his hand still resting on the car's door handle. He turned and studied Richard for a moment, his dark eyes calm but sharp. He had dealt with men like Richard his entire life, people who judged him without knowing anything about him, people who looked at him and only saw the color of his skin, never his accomplishments, his struggles, or his worth. Marcus wasn't surprised, but he felt the familiar sting of being dismissed, of being seen as less. He had learned long ago when to speak up and when to let things slide. Today, he chose silence. "I'm looking for a car for my brother," Marcus said evenly. "I'll take a look around." Richard folded his arms across his chest and leaned against the counter, giving a smug smile. "Well, let me know if you find anything in your price range," he said, his voice laced with condescension. Marcus felt the weight of those words, but he didn't flinch. He continued to walk the showroom floor, inspecting a few more cars. Inside, though, a storm was brewing. He had worked hard to build his life, to rise above the stereotypes that society had placed on him. He was a leader, a man of influence, but here, in this small dealership, he was just another black man, subjected to the small-minded judgments of a man who had no idea who he was talking to. After a few minutes, Marcus approached Richard again, inquiring about the financing options for one of the cars. Richard looked up from his phone, visibly irritated. "I'm sure you'll want to look at something more affordable," Richard said dismissively. "These models here are pretty high-end. We don't do charity." Marcus's eyes darkened slightly, but his face remained calm, the years of restraint holding back the growing anger. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking about the price." Richard scoffed, waving his hand as if dismissing Marcus altogether. "Look, I'm going to save us both some time. This isn't a place for people like you. Maybe try somewhere else." There it was. The mask was off, and the racism that Richard had kept hidden behind his sarcasm and professionalism came out in full. Marcus felt a surge of emotion, but he held it in check. He knew he could crush this man, financially, physically, however he wanted. But Marcus didn't work that way. Instead, he nodded once, a gesture that said more than any words could. As he turned to leave, Richard couldn't help himself. "Good luck finding something you can afford." That was the breaking point. Marcus stopped in his tracks, his back still to Richard. Slowly, he turned around and walked back toward the counter with deliberate, measured steps. The entire showroom seemed to hold its breath as he approached. Without a word, Marcus stood before Richard, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the smaller man. Richard, feeling the shift in energy, started to say something, but before he could finish his sentence, Marcus raised his hand and slapped Richard across the face. The crack echoed through the showroom, stunning Richard and the handful of employees who had been watching from the sidelines. Richard stumbled back, clutching his cheek in disbelief. The audacity. In his mind, this wasn't just an assault. It was an affront to his very sense of superiority. He couldn't fathom that someone like Marcus, a black man no less, would dare to strike him. "How dare you?" Richard sputtered, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. There was something about Marcus's presence that terrified him now. The casual arrogance that had defined their earlier conversation had disappeared, replaced with a primal fear. Marcus stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "You'll regret that. Remember my face." With that, Marcus turned and walked out of the dealership, leaving behind an air of tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Richard stood frozen, still reeling from the slap, his mind racing. Who was this man? What had he done? But instead of introspection, Richard's thoughts turned toward revenge. He would make Marcus pay for this. No one slapped Richard Thompson and got away with it. Or so he thought. The following days brought a series of strange occurrences that Richard couldn't explain. His dealership's top customers started pulling out of deals without any clear reason. Online, the dealership was bombarded with negative reviews, tanking its reputation almost overnight. Richard's phone rang constantly with complaints, and his business began to crumble before his eyes. At first he thought it was a coincidence, but the problems continued to escalate. His best salesman abruptly quit, citing concerns about safety, though he refused to elaborate. The bank informed Richard of unusual activity in his accounts, and it became clear that his entire life was unraveling at an alarming pace. It wasn't until Richard received an anonymous letter that the pieces started to come together. The letter was brief but chilling. "You were warned. We own this city. Apologize, or it gets worse." Richard's hands trembled as he read the note. He knew this was Marcus's doing. He had underestimated the man, and now he was paying the price. Richard's life, his business, and his reputation were being systematically destroyed by forces he couldn't see. let alone control. Desperate and terrified, Richard decided he had to confront Marcus. He managed to track him down to a bar on the outskirts of the city, a place he would never have gone to under normal circumstances. As he entered, the smell of cigarette smoke and the low hum of conversations filled the air. In the back, Marcus sat at a table surrounded by men who looked just as dangerous as he did. Richard approached cautiously, his usual arrogance nowhere to be found. His heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in a long while, Richard felt truly out of his depth. Marcus looked up as Richard approached, his expression unreadable. The men around him fell silent, their eyes fixed on Richard. "You've been ruining my business," Richard said, his voice weak. "I want it to stop." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Richard with a calm that unnerved him. "You still don't get it, do you?" Marcus's voice was steady, almost casual, but the weight of his words hit Richard hard. "This isn't about your business. This is about respect." "I didn't mean to offend you," Richard stammered, though he knew deep down that wasn't true. "I didn't know who you were." "That's the problem," Marcus replied. "You didn't care who I was. You didn't see me as a person, just as something beneath you. This isn't just about me. It's about every person like me who you've dismissed because of the color of their skin." Richard's face burned with shame. He wanted to defend himself, to say that he wasn't racist, that it had just been a misunderstanding. But he couldn't find the words. For the first time, he saw himself through Marcus's eyes, and he didn't like what he saw. "I'll do whatever you want," Richard said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Just stop ruining my life." Marcus regarded him silently for a moment, then leaned forward. "I don't want to ruin your life. I want you to understand. You think you're better than people like me because of where you come from, because of the skin you were born with. But that's over. This city isn't yours anymore. And if you don't change, you'll find yourself with nothing." Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What do you want from me?" "I want a public apology," Marcus said. "Not just to me, but to everyone you've disrespected. Own up to what you've done. Admit that you were wrong. Then, and only then, will this end." Richard hesitated. A public apology? His pride screamed against it, but he knew he had no choice. Marcus had made that clear. "Okay," Richard said quietly. "I'll do it." The next day, Richard stood outside his dealership, a small crowd gathered around. He had called the local press, as Marcus had demanded, and prepared to give his apology. The shame and humiliation were almost unbearable, but Richard knew this was the only way to salvage what was left of his life. As he stepped up to the microphone, Richard cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "I'm here today to apologize," he began. "Not just to Marcus, but to everyone I've ever wronged. My actions were wrong. I disrespected someone based on my own prejudices, and I'm deeply sorry." He looked out into the crowd, where Marcus stood with his arms crossed, watching. Richard could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to see the world from a different perspective. "I've made mistakes," Richard continued, his voice stronger now, "but I'm committed to learning from them, to becoming a better person. I know words alone aren't enough, but I hope this can be the beginning of something better." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Richard wasn't sure if anyone believed him, and part of him wondered if he even believed himself. But then slowly, a few people began to nod, and the tension in the air seemed to lift, just a little. Marcus stepped forward, looking Richard in the eye. "We're done here," he said quietly. And with that, he walked away, his men following him. Richard stood there, feeling the weight of what had just happened. He knew his life would never be the same. He had been humbled, not just by Marcus, but by the harsh realization of his own failings. Character reflection and development. In the end, the story is not just about the slap, but about how it forced both men to confront their realities. Richard, for all his flaws, begins a journey toward self-awareness, though whether he fully changes remains an open question. He realizes that his success has been built on a foundation of unexamined privilege and racism. His pride is shattered, but perhaps that's what was needed for him to grow. Marcus, on the other hand, maintains his strength and leadership, but also shows that true power isn't about domination. It's about knowing when to show mercy. He had the capacity to destroy Richard completely, but he chose a path that could lead to understanding rather than destruction. Marcus remains a complex figure, navigating the thin line between the world he controls and the world he wishes to change.